They've put a price on you. A clean number, neat little zeros, like danger can be measured and fear can be itemized. $1 million says you told the truth out loud and the room went quiet. Funny thing about truth, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door in, rearranges the furniture, and smiles while everyone pretends not to see the mess. You didn't expose a monster because you wanted applause. You did it because silence was choking you. And now every shadow feels interested. Every phone buzz feels personal. And suddenly you're very aware of how fragile courage looks when it's standing alone, laughing at the idea that safety was ever part of the deal. A price on truth doesn't make it a lie. It just proves how badly someone needs it buried. See, lies don't need bodyguards. They don't need hush money or men with cold eyes and cheaper morals standing in dark corners. Lies get invited in, poured a drink, told they're doing a great job. Truth, though, truth walks in unannounced, tracks mud across the carpet, laughs at the DA core, and suddenly everyone's checking the exits. The moment a number gets attached to your name, you learn something important, not about yourself, but about them. You learn that what you said hit a nerve so deep it started bleeding. And bleeding things panic. They always do. People like to believe truth is fragile, like it needs protection, like it can be snapped in half if enough pressure is applied. That's adorable. Truth doesn't break when you threaten it, it multiplies. You put a price on it, and now it's valuable. You chase it, and now it's moving. You try to kill it, and suddenly everyone wants to know why you're so nervous. That $1 million isn't a warning, it's a confession. It says, "This mattered more than we expected." It says, "We thought no one would notice." It says, "You weren't supposed to say that part out loud." Funny thing is, the world runs on prices. Everyone's got one. Careers, reputations, loyalty, silence. Cheap ones go fast. Expensive ones pretend they're priceless. When they slap a number on you, they're just playing the same old game, hoping you'll do the math and decide it's not worth it, hoping fear will feel heavier than integrity, hoping survival will look smarter than honesty. And for most people, it does. Most people fold before the ink dries. Most people call it wisdom, when it's really just surrender dressed up in a nice suit. But a price doesn't change what's real. You don't wake up wrong just because someone else woke up threatened. Gravity doesn't stop working because it offends someone. Fire doesn't apologize for burning. Truth is like that. It doesn't care how uncomfortable it makes the room, and it definitely doesn't care how much money is waved around like a magic trick. All that money says is that the truth walked into a place built entirely on pretending, and now the walls are shaking because everyone realizes how thin they really are. They want you to believe the number defines you, that it reduces you to a target, a problem, an inconvenience that can be erased. But listen closely. That number exists because you couldn't be erased by ignoring you. If you were irrelevant, they'd laugh and move on. If you were harmless, they'd pat you on the head and let you talk. The price shows up when denial stops working. The price shows up when control slips. The price shows up when the story they sold for years starts cracking under the weight of a single inconvenient voice. So no, a price on truth doesn't make it a lie. It makes it expensive. It makes it dangerous to the right people. It makes it radioactive in rooms full of smiling faces and locked doors. It turns whispers into echoes and secrets into liabilities. And the real joke is, once that number is out there, once the threat is spoken, there's no going back to pretending nothing happened. Because now everyone knows the truth was powerful enough to scare someone who thought they owned the world. And when people realize that, they start wondering what else has been hidden, what other prices have already been paid, and how many lies they've been living inside without ever asking who benefits when they stay quiet. and who starts shaking the moment someone decides not to play along anymore, and just keeps talking, smiling, standing there knowing that if truth was really weak, it wouldn't need $1 million worth of fear to try and shut it up, while it keeps breathing right in front of them. And watching how the confidence turns into desperate raises, and when the truth refuses to die and just keeps laughing under the weight of everything they throw at it, because it was never theirs to control in the first thing, and it will be as long as someone is still willing to say it out loud by one, and when or keeps trying clouding in his power and hoping no one notices how afraid it really is, and the tip staring back like it's waiting for the next longest rising back where the tail of another said to would be long first watch the moment next move. Fear is the currency they use to control you. Not because it's rare, but because it's renewable. You spend a little today. They make sure you earn some more tomorrow. Every headline, every warning, every raised eyebrow that says, "Be careful," is just another coin slipped into your pocket, whether you asked for it or not. And the trick is, they convinced everyone that fear is protection, that it keeps you safe, that it's doing you a favor while it quietly decides where you're allowed to stand, what you're allowed to say, and how loudly you're allowed to breathe. You don't even notice the transaction at first. It feels normal. It feels responsible. It feels like adulthood. That's how good the con is. They don't need chains anymore. Chains are loud. Chains make people ask questions. Fear is polite. Fear smiles. Fear tells you it's on your side while it rearranges your spine, so you're always slightly bent forward, just enough to bow without realizing you're doing it. They sell it in small doses first, just enough to make you hesitate, just enough to make you doubt your instincts, just enough to make you check the room before you speak. And once you start paying with fear, they know you're a customer for life. Because fear compounds. The more you use it, the more you need it. The real genius is how cheap it is for them. Fear doesn't cost bullets. It doesn't cost blood. It doesn't cost explanations. It costs a rumor, a threat, a look that lasts half a second too long, a story about what happened to someone else who didn't play along. They let your imagination do the heavy lifting. Because imagination is crueler than reality and way more obedient. You scare yourself better than they ever could, and they just sit back and collect interest. That's the economy they built, and business has been very good. Once fear becomes the standard currency, everything else inflates. Courage looks reckless. Honesty looks suicidal. Integrity looks like a luxury item only idiots buy. You start negotiating with yourself like you're two different people. One who knows what's right, and one who's very invested in waking up tomorrow without complications. And the funny part is how quickly people start calling that inner argument wisdom. They clap for restraint. They reward silence. They hand out medals for not rocking the boat, while the boat is already leaking and everyone can smell the water. Fear keeps people predictable. Predictable people are easy to manage. They line up, they wait their turn. They don't ask why the rules keep changing, as long as the punishment stays vague. Fear teaches you to accept uncertainty from above, while demanding certainty from yourself. And that imbalance is delicious to anyone who wants control. As long as you're busy managing your anxiety, you're not managing the system that gave it to you in the first place. As long as you're scared of consequences, you never ask who decided what counts as a consequence. And here's the joke nobody laughs at until it's too late. Fear only works if you believe it will end. If you think compliance buys peace, if you think silence eventually gets rewarded with safety. But fear doesn't retire. It doesn't say thank you. It doesn't give you a gold watch for years of loyal service. The moment you pay it once, it knows you're willing, and the price goes up. Today it's your voice. Tomorrow it's your principles. Eventually it's your sense of self. And by then you're defending the very thing that hollowed you out, because admitting the truth would mean admitting how much you've already lost. They don't control you by being powerful. They control you by being patient. Fear is slow. It seeps. It waits for tired days and bad news and moments when standing up feels heavier than staying quiet. And when someone finally refuses to pay, when someone decides fear isn't legal tender anymore, that's when the system panics. Because nothing scares people who trade in fear more than realizing it only ever worked because everyone agreed to keep using it. And the moment that agreement breaks, the whole economy starts shaking and nobody knows what the currency is worth anymore, and the silence they depended on starts to feel louder than any scream, and all those carefully planted threats begin to sound hollow when someone stands there unmoved, smiling like they've already spent all the fear they had and discovered there's nothing left to collect and no leverage left to pull, and the illusion starts cracking under the weight of one person who just won't buy what they're selling anymore and keeps standing there like the joke finally landed, but nobody else knows why yet. Exposure turns power into panic, and panic is ugly when it realizes it's being watched. Power loves darkness, not because it's mysterious, but because it's lazy. Darkness lets it sprawl, lets it rot comfortably without anyone counting the flies. The moment light hits it, everything changes. The posture stiffens, the voice cracks, the confidence that once filled rooms suddenly needs explaining. That's how you know it was never strength to begin with. Real strength doesn't flinch when the curtains get pulled back. Fake power screams about respect while frantically checking who's holding the flashlight. People think power is loud, that it announces itself with speeches and symbols and flags waving in slow motion. That's the costume. Actual power prefers quiet hallways, closed meetings, and decisions made when no one's taking notes. It survives on the assumption that no one will look too closely, no one will ask the wrong question, no one will connect the dots because connecting dots is uncomfortable and dangerous and bad for your health. So power builds myths about itself. It calls itself necessary. It calls itself inevitable. It calls itself too big to challenge, hoping everyone mistakes size for stability. Exposure ruins that illusion. Exposure doesn't argue. It doesn't debate. It doesn't ask for permission. It just points. And pointing is terrifying to people who rely on everyone else looking away. Once eyes start focusing, power loses its favorite weapon, which is ambiguity. When things are vague, power can be anything it needs to be in the moment. Protector one day, victim the next. Savior in public, executioner in private. Exposure forces consistency, and consistency is a prison for anyone who's been living off contradictions. The first sign of panic is overreaction. Suddenly, there are statements, denials, clarifications nobody asked for. Suddenly, the calm authority needs to explain itself very loudly and very quickly. That's not confidence. That's someone trying to outrun a shadow that just learned how to follow. Power that's comfortable doesn't rush. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't need to make examples. Panic does. Panic needs spectacle. Panic needs noise. Panic needs to remind everyone how dangerous it still is, because it can feel the ground shifting under its feet. Exposure also changes the audience. Before, power spoke and people listened because they assumed it knew what it was doing. After exposure, people listen differently. They hear cracks. They notice evasions. They replay old statements with new context and realize how much nonsense they applauded without question. Power hates rewatching the tape. It hates memory. It hates patterns. It thrives on short attention spans and selective amnesia. Exposure gives people something to remember, something to compare, something to measure against reality, instead of promises. And then there's the paranoia. Once exposed, power starts seeing enemies everywhere. Critics become threats. Questions become attacks. Neutrality becomes betrayal. That's when you know the mask is glued on and starting to slip. When power can't tell the difference between accountability and assassination, it lashes out at both. It starts punishing curiosity. It starts rewarding obedience more aggressively. Not because it's winning, but because it's scared that if one person saw through it, others might be looking too. The funniest part is how exposure doesn't actually take anything away. It doesn't steal resources or topple structures overnight. All it does is remove the illusion of invincibility. And that's enough. Power that believes in its own myth can survive almost anything. Power that knows it's been seen starts making mistakes. It rushes. It contradicts itself. It reveals more than it intends because panic is sloppy and fear has a terrible poker face. Every move becomes reactive instead of strategic, emotional instead of calculated. That's why exposure is treated like a crime by those who benefit from secrecy. Not because it destroys them immediately, but because it forces them to exist in reality instead of fantasy. And reality is where power has to prove itself instead of just assuming compliance. Once people see that power can sweat, can stumble, can sound unsure, the spell weakens. You can't unsee panic. You can't unknow that the thing you were told to fear bleeds, just like everything else. And once that realization sets in, once people recognize that all that authority was held together by silence and intimidation and a shared agreement not to look too hard, the balance shifts quietly, invisibly at first, but irreversibly, because power exposed is power that has to keep performing. And performance is exhausting when the audience finally knows it's watching a show and starts waiting for the next mistake instead of applauding on cue. Courage looks insane before it looks brave, because sanity is usually defined by whoever's most comfortable, with things staying exactly the same. The moment you step out of line, stop nodding, stop agreeing just to survive the day, the room tilts its head and decides you've lost your mind. Not because you're wrong, but because you're unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies systems built on routine obedience. Courage doesn't enter quietly, doesn't clear its throat, doesn't ask if now is a good time. It barges in with a grin that says it already knows it won't be welcome. At first, courage doesn't get applause. It gets labels. Reckless, delusional. People love diagnosing what they're afraid of. It makes dismissal feel clinical instead of cowardly. They'll tell you to calm down, to be realistic, to think about consequences, as if you haven't already weighed them and decided the cost of silence was higher. They'll say you're acting emotional, because logic is their favorite disguise for fear. Anything to avoid admitting that what you're doing exposes how little they're willing to risk themselves. Courage disrupts the script. Everyone else is following cues, hitting marks, repeating lines they memorized years ago. Then you improvise. You say something unscripted. You move when you were supposed to stay still. Suddenly, the whole performance wobbles, and instead of questioning the script, they point at you and whisper that you're ruining the show. That's how bravery first appears, not as heroism, but as a problem that needs to be managed. There's a loneliness to it too, the kind people don't warn you about. Courage doesn't arrive with a crowd. It arrives with silence, with people suddenly busy, suddenly distant, suddenly concerned for your well, being in a way that feels more like self-preservation than care. They don't want to stand next to someone who might draw attention. They don't want to be associated with a question mark. It's easier to let you look crazy than to risk looking curious themselves. And the irony is, courage usually starts as desperation. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet exhaustion of pretending. The moment when fear stops being effective because living small has become unbearable. From the outside, it looks like a breakdown. From the inside, it feels like the first honest breath in years. But nobody sees that part. They just see the break from normal. And normal has a very loud opinion about being challenged. Over time, something strange happens. The same people who shook their heads start squinting. The madness doesn't collapse. The world doesn't end. The sky stubbornly refuses to fall. And slowly, reluctantly, the narrative shifts. What was once reckless becomes bold. What was once dangerous becomes visionary. Courage ages well. Insanity, apparently, just needed time to prove it wasn't bluffing. But by then, the cost has already been paid. Courage doesn't get refunds. It doesn't retroactively make the isolation easier or the nights quieter. It just keeps moving forward, leaving behind a trail of second thoughts and missed chances for everyone who chose safety over truth. And those people will eventually rewrite history, convincing themselves they believed in you all along. That they always knew you'd be right. That they were just waiting for the right moment. That's the final joke. Courage never looks brave to the people who benefit from you staying quiet. It only looks brave after it survives them. Before that, it looks like madness wrapped in conviction, smiling at the idea that approval was ever required, standing there while everyone else whispers and waits for it to fail. Because if it doesn't, they might have to ask themselves why they never moved when they had the chance and why it was easier to call someone crazy than to admit they were afraid and still are watching a safe distance wondering how long courage can keep standing there without permission while the definition of sanity keeps shifting around it, trying to catch up and catch at permission or trying to catch up and failing every single time. Silence keeps monsters employed because quiet is the most reliable job security in the world. You don't need loyalty. You don't need belief. You just need people to look away and mind their own business. Monsters thrive on that kind of professionalism. Clock in, do the damage, clock out, knowing no one's going to ask uncomfortable questions as long as the noise level stays manageable. Silence isn't passive like people pretend. It's active. It signs contracts. It shakes hands. It agrees to terms without ever reading the fine print. Most monsters don't break in through the door. They get invited in through exhaustion. People are tired. Tired of arguing. Tired of explaining. Tired of being the only one in the room who notices something's wrong. Silence shows up offering relief. It says, "You don't have to fight today." And for a while, that feels like mercy. But mercy has a way of turning into routine. And routine is where monsters unpack their bags and start redecorating. The scary part is how normal it all becomes. The abuse, the corruption, the slow rot, it blends into the background like bad wallpaper. Everyone sees it, nobody mentions it. Jokes get made, eyes get rolled, warnings get softened into whispers. Silence teaches people how to live with things they once swore they'd never tolerate. And it does it so gently, they don't even feel themselves shrinking. That's the real horror show. Not the monster itself, but how easily people adapt to its presence. Silence also has this clever way of disguising itself as neutrality. "I'm just staying out of it. It's not my place. I don't know the full story." Those phrases sound reasonable, responsible even. But monsters love reasonable people. Reasonable people don't interfere. Reasonable people wait for permission. Reasonable people assume someone else will handle it. Meanwhile, the monster keeps working overtime, promoted by every moment nothing happens. And when someone finally speaks up, silence turns hostile. It pretends it was peace all along and accuses the voice of being disruptive. Suddenly, the problem isn't the monster, it's the noise. The timing? Why now? They ask, as if harm has an expiration date. Silence resents being exposed, because exposure threatens its usefulness. Once things are named, once patterns are acknowledged, silence loses its cover story. There's a strange loyalty people feel toward silence, too. It protected them once, or at least it felt like it did. Speaking up didn't keep them safe back then, so they learned the lesson incorrectly. They confuse survival with virtue. They confuse not being targeted with being innocent. Silence rewards that confusion by letting them sleep at night, even if the nightmares belong to someone else. Monsters don't fear strength as much as they fear witnesses. They can handle resistance. They can crush opposition. What they hate is being seen clearly, consistently, without theatrics. Silence keeps them blurry. It turns accountability into a foggy rumor instead of a solid accusation. As long as no one speaks plainly, monsters get to rewrite reality in real time, convincing everyone that what's happening isn't happening the way it looks like it's happening. And the wildest part is how silence convinces itself it's powerless. What difference would my voice make? That question has kept more monsters fed than any weapon ever could. Silence understates its own influence because admitting its power would mean admitting responsibility. It's easier to believe you don't matter than to accept that your quiet might be part of the machinery. Every system that protects monsters is built less on cruelty and more on compliance, on people deciding, one by one, that today isn't the day to speak. Silence stacks up. It layers. It becomes a structure so solid it feels immovable. Until someone finally refuses to contribute another brick, and the whole thing starts to wobble, because it turns out the monster was never that strong. It was just surrounded by people who agreed not to make a sound and keep going about their lives while telling themselves that quiet meant harmless and distance meant innocent survival meant justification. And by the time one realizes style doing all the heavy lifting, the monster has already grown comfortable left and help leave it leftwards has a foreigner who dares to stick now with interrupt a system that only ever worked because everything would get their mouths shut and recall it to be working please over what's happened to the If they're hunting you, it means you mattered, because nobody wastes resources chasing ghosts. Indifference is reserved for the harmless, the quiet, the ones who blend into the wallpaper and never disturb the furniture. Hunters don't mobilize for nothing. They don't coordinate, threaten, whisper names in back rooms over lukewarm coffee unless something went wrong. And wrong, in their language, usually means someone stepped outside the role they were assigned and refused to crawl back in when told. Being hunted is proof of impact. It means your existence created friction. You disrupted flow. You forced movement where stagnation was comfortable. People like to romanticize being ignored, call it peace, call it freedom. But real power doesn't ignore what can hurt it. Real power watches, tracks, calculates. The moment attention turns sharp and personal, the moment the air changes when you enter a room, you've crossed from irrelevant to inconvenient. And inconvenience is the first stage of threat. They'll try to make you believe the hunt defines you as reckless, irresponsible, dangerous. Labels are cheaper than accountability. It's easier to demonize the disturbance than to examine why the disturbance happened in the first place. If they can make you feel guilty for being noticed, ashamed for being targeted, you might start doing their work for them. You might shrink. You might apologize. You might disappear voluntarily and save them the trouble. But think about the math for a second. Chasing costs energy, surveillance costs time, intimidation costs coordination, fear campaigns cost maintenance. Nobody invests that kind of effort into something meaningless. The hunt exists because something you did or said or represented threatened a balance that was benefiting someone else. And balance is sacred to people sitting comfortably on top of it. They don't call it injustice. They call it order. Being hunted also strips away illusions fast. You learn who's watching, who's silent, who suddenly remembers urgent appointments whenever your name comes up. Neutrality evaporates when pressure enters the room. People reveal themselves not through speeches, but through absence. Some vanish. Some warn you softly, hoping concern will disguise their fear. A rare few stand closer, The hunt clarifies the landscape. It redraws the map in permanent ink. There's a psychological trick they rely on too. They want the hunt to feel personal, isolating, overwhelming. Like you accidentally wandered into a storm that has nothing to do with anyone else. That way you internalize it. You start asking what you should have done differently, how you could have avoided this, whether staying quiet would have kept things simpler. Self-doubt is cheaper than force and far more effective. A person who blames themselves is already halfway contained. But being hunted is not a verdict, it's feedback. Loud, frantic feedback from a system that just realized you're not as small as it hoped. The fear you feel isn't proof of weakness. It's proof of proximity. You got close enough to something sensitive that it lashed out. And lashes are defensive. They don't come from confidence. They come from exposure and uncertainty and the sudden realization that control isn't as airtight as advertised. They also underestimate the psychological shift that happens once you accept the hunt. Once you stop pretending safety was ever guaranteed. Once you stop negotiating with fear like it's a reasonable landlord instead of a squatter. When you realize you're being chased not because you failed, but because you succeeded too loudly, the dynamic changes. Fear loses its moral authority. It becomes noise instead of command. And here's the part they never account for. A hunted person pays attention. A hunted person learns patterns, notices habits, understands pressure points. The act of hunting sharpens the very thing they're trying to eliminate. It forces awareness. It forces growth. It forces adaptation. The chase teaches you how the system moves, where it stumbles, what it's desperate to protect, and desperation always leaves fingerprints. So yes, if they're hunting you, it means you mattered. It means you disrupted something that wanted to remain untouched. It means your presence forced a reaction that silence never could. It means you became visible in a world that survives by keeping certain truths invisible. And once visibility happens, it can't be undone, no matter how aggressively they try to erase it. Because the hunt itself becomes evidence that you were never insignificant, never harmless, never just another face in the crowd, but someone who stepped far enough outside the expected path that the machinery had to turn its head and reveal itself in motion. And once you've seen that, once you've felt the weight of attention, that only comes from threatening the status quo, you understand that being hunted was never the punishment they wanted it to be. It was confirmation that you touched something real and lived long enough to watch it panic and start running after you hoping you'd forget why you started moving in the first place.